One of India's top bankers is facing the heat as investigative agencies probe allegations of quid pro quo in loans given to the Videocon group. The ICICI Bank top boss finds himself in a spot of bother. What's more, according to Bloomberg, the bank's board seems to be divided over Kochhar's future at the helm of India's second largest private sector bank. Will Chanda Kochhar stay on, or should she step down while investigations are on? To talk about this, I'm joined now by R. Gopalan, former Economic Affairs Secretary, and Tarun Bhatia of Kroll Securities. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for speaking with us this evening. Mr. Gopalan, your first view on what we have seen today. There are two effective pieces of news in relation with the ICICI Bank story. One is, of course, the Bloomberg story, very key, which says that the board, which 10 days ago was wholeheartedly backing Chanda, is now divided. That some members are saying that maybe she needs to step down while investigations are on. And then there's Fitch Ratings, which has expressed its concern.
Well, I would say that, as far as Chanda Kochhar's issue is concerned, she has led the bank very well, ably, for quite a long time. Now, let us conduct an inquiry. Whoever does it, the RBI does it, or the bank itself transparently does an investigation. Let that be conducted. Then let us decide based on that what is to be done with her. Why we should suddenly get into the, based on certain reports or certain agencies' reports, why should we suddenly get into the habit of stating that why should she not step down? I don't think this is correct. She has provided stability to the bank for quite a good number of years, done a lot of good job. I think we should not forget them in the heat of this moment.
No, absolutely. The question arises, and I'm just quoting from the Fitch report as well. Fitch itself says that the fact that ICICI board has not agreed to an outside independent inquiry has raised questions. And that seems to be a part of the problem as well. Do you think that that is something that could be rectified, Mr. Gopalan, that there should be an independent outside inquiry?
I believe there should be an independent outside inquiry into the whole issue, because that would certainly clear the name of Mrs. Kochhar if there has been no wrongdoing. It will also enhance credibility of the bank in the way in which the board, in which it runs the bank operations, and also get transparency across to everyone, and in one way or the other it would settle the issue.
Mr. Bhatia, would you agree with both those points? And I'll come to point number one right now. Mr. Gopalan is right. There is suddenly this chorus of voices asking for Chanda Kochhar to step down, at least till inquiries are complete. Do you think that that is necessary at this point?
No, so I agree with Mr. Gopalan. I think investigations or any inquiry need to run their own course, and we need to keep in mind that banks continue to function, and the board would have been in continuous dialogue with the CEO over the past few days, including when they came out with a statement, and even over the last 10 to 12 days as more information or news keeps coming out. I think unless there is something specifically which makes the board feel that stepping down would help in doing an independent investigation, or then one could look at it. Otherwise, I think it could be premature. I think that the key question is really, and Mr. Gopalan also mentioned to it, is the willingness of the bank to go through an independent investigation, which will allow one to really understand how things functioned. We're talking about a fairly dated event, but subsequent monitoring, and there are certain facts of the case which are already being looked into by the Central Investigation Agency in any case. So I think the key question here is, this is not the typical NPA issue. This is an issue around conflict of interest, and in a listed company, that is looked very seriously globally. In India also, that's becoming increasingly a bigger issue. And I think any transparency that any listed company can offer around the way they function and key decisions are taken would be taken in a very positive sign by the markets.
Now, let's look at what has changed in the last few days, because about 10 days ago, the board said they have full faith and confidence in Chanda Kochhar. Now we have a report from Bloomberg which says that some in the board may be divided about her staying on. In this interim, there have been investigations which have begun from central agencies. There has been questioning of Chanda Kochhar's brother-in-law. You've had her husband, Deepak Kochhar, come out and tell India Today that she had no knowledge of what was happening. So it is in the background of all of this that the story seems to have moved forward. And I'm going to ask Tarun Bhatia that question first. Do you think that all of these events in the last few days, especially where the investigation is going, will bear on the board as they review and re-look at the situation?
I mean, of course it does. You need to keep in mind that board is representing, in a way, the shareholders, and they are supposed to take an independent view. And if there is material information which they believe could question the credibility of the bank, then they are well within their rights to explore it. Whether it's the right decision, one could question that, but we have seen that happen. I think the key question here really is, and it's a lot of things coming together. So we are hearing about, the large account Videocon. We are talking about an advisory association which could have a related party issue. I think the key aspect here would be, at any point if the board feels that, certain information that should have been provided as part of the dealings, which was not provided, and what were the reasons behind that. So any aspect of the transactions over the last 7 to 8 years which makes them feel that we need to have an independent view, then boards are known to take extreme view. And as I said, it being a listed company puts increased pressure. There is regulatory representation on the board. There would be questions asked of regulators as well, as we have seen over the last 2 months. So, you shouldn't count it out that the board takes an extreme step, but we still believe that the right way in events like this is to let the investigation conclude, and if the outcome clearly suggests wrongdoing, then accordingly an appropriate action should be taken.
Okay, let me put to Mr. Gopalan what we know in the public domain. And I'm quoting from the interview Deepak Kochhar gave India Today TV a few days ago. He said, and I quote, "Chanda did not know when I set up New Power. I knew Dhoot through social circles. I told her when Dhoot exited." He also goes on to argue about where is the conflict of interest. ICICI Bank will have relationships with all top corporates in India. If I can't touch any corporate who deals with ICICI, is it fair to me? Those are two of the key points that he made in that interview. Do you think that these are credible arguments? Because this is literally the first we know of what the counter will be from the Kochhars. And the first point seems to be that Chanda Kochhar did not know, Mr. Gopalan.
Well, I am not going to comment on it. This is something which can always be interpreted in different ways by different set of people. So that's an issue which can come about in an investigation, but I'm not going to focus so much on that. But the second point he made, that he also has to have a livelihood. He is also a professional. He has also got to carry on his profession. Now, nobody can prevent him from doing it. And if it involves, and ICICI has any number of clients, and if he has to deal with some of them, so be it. But the disclosure in those cases must be very clearly made to the board, to everybody concerned. That disclosure must be very detailed. It should not be for form's sake. It must be more in spirit than in form. So in that sense, I think the second argument of Mr. Kochhar is very, very valid, subject to this caveat which I have provided.
Sure. Mr. Bhatia, I want to go back to what Fitch has said in his press release today based on its note, where it says that nevertheless the presence of the bank CEO on this credit committee, which of course extended loans to the Videocon group, and the bank's reluctance to support an independent probe have, in our opinion, created doubts over the strength of its corporate governance practices. Now, the two key counter arguments or defense, if I could use that word, for ICICI Bank was that number one, Chanda Kochhar was part of the credit committee but was not chairing it when those loans were extended to Videocon. And secondly, it was part of a consortium in which there were some 20 other banks. Is this enough for ICICI Bank to sort of ignore all the pressure which is going to build even more so in the days to come?
No, so I'll build from what Rajpran said. Really, conflict of interest can exist across businesses. Every business has conflict of interest. I think it's about disclosure. I think best practices suggest that if there is a conflict of interest, then it needs to be specified. I mean, if it's at people at board level, it needs to be articulated and spelled out far more, obviously. Secondly, not chairing a committee in itself may not be a valid argument. I think one should recluse themselves or, abstain themselves from a specific discussion. Again, best practices across firms suggest that's the way to go about it. So I think both of them are critical. I mean, we are not, currently privy to the information about what got discussed, how much did the board know. I think family members are allowed and, to do businesses and have their own interest. I think if it conflicts, then there has to be a complete disclosure, which is the question which is being asked here. And I think the investigation also needs to look into that aspect. So, because it's the question is not can a bank deal with somebody which is related to them. It can very well deal. It is about disclosure, full information, and are decisions taken independently or not. So I think what Fitch is highlighting is, the bank is not coming out, very transparently around that, which from a rating point of view is something which they are questioning. I think the matter related to independent investigation, it's a question, for the board to really answer as to why they are not going ahead for it at this point of time.
Mr. Bhatia, in your view, do you think that Chanda Kochhar will stay on the board through the course of this investigation? Her tenure ends only in 2019, 31st March 2019. Do you see her completing this term?
It's a tough one to comment on, in light of what we are already seeing, which happened earlier today. So I think we are in an environment where, there's a lot of accountability on senior leadership. And I don't want to put a finger on the specific question, but I wouldn't be surprised if, boards go ahead and take extreme decisions in such events.
Of course, Tarun Bhatia is referring to the news earlier in the day that Shikha Sharma's term will be curtailed to 6 months, 2.5 years before her fourth term would have ended. Mr. Gopalan, I'm going to ask you that question as well before I let you go. In your assessment, do you see Mrs. Kochhar continuing through her term till 31st March 2019, looking at things as they stand today?
It's a difficult question to answer. First of all, an inquiry is going on. When it ends, then what it reveals at the end of it will be a factor in deciding. Second, I still believe strongly that the ICICI board should go in for an independent outside inquiry, and that outcome of that inquiry should also decide about Mrs. Kochhar's fate of continuance in the bank. So I have a feeling that we have to go by the output of these investigations and this analysis by an outside independent agency. Once that is done, then whatever is the outcome of it will be inputs to the board to decide whether Mrs. Kochhar should continue or not.
All right, I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Mr. Gopalan and Mr. Bhatia, for joining us on that conversation.